All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to give it 1 minute to let everyone kind of roll into the webinar before we get started, but I promise after 1 minute, we'll get rolling. Well, that wasn't quite 1 minute, but I see lots of people joining us, so I'll get us kicked off. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and these amazing, incredible people and speakers that we're going to get to learn from today about the vital importance of Indigenous science for protecting biodiversity, communities, and for taking climate action. My name is Alana Dawn. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships and Events Coordinator at the Office of Sustainability, and just really excited to learn from these wonderful people. So thank you. Okay, so to start the session in a good way, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Calgary is located in the heart of Southern Alberta. Both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pekini, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. So I share this land acknowledgement to honor and respect Indigenous cultural protocols and express my gratitude to live on this land. As a settler, I acknowledge my responsibilities as a Treaty 7 person and strive for truth and reconciliation. And I also hear the call from many Indigenous peoples that more truth needs to be understood before there can be reconciliation. I encourage us all to read the Truth and Reconciliation 94 Calls to Action and the Itapato Strategy to reflect and take action to implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and recommendations in our communities, workplaces, and advocacy efforts. Indigenous communities are the most impacted by climate and social injustices and ongoing colonialism, and are leaders in taking care of the land, the more than human world, communities, and in climate action. I'm very grateful for the people here today who's going to be sharing their expertise in Indigenous science, your research, and your wisdom with us. And invite you all, whether you're in your home or in your office, to just take a moment to reflect and express your gratitude as well. So as I mentioned today, I'm excited to begin the Climate Conversation Speaker Series with this amazing session. The purpose for the Climate Conversation Speaker Series is to engage in transformative conversations on climate action, to learn from and share diverse perspectives and worldviews on climate action so people can take equitable climate action and connect with the climate action community. So if you'd like to see the other events we have coming up this year, you're welcome to scan this QR code. I'm also very grateful that today's session is part of the Calgary Climate Symposium. So thanks to the Calgary Climate team for this collaboration. There's some amazing events happening this week. So again, you can click this QR code to see what's happening. Okay, so our flow for today's session, we're going to introduce these amazing speakers that will then hear their presentations and engage in a discussion with the moderator. And then we have Q&A with all of you. So you'll probably notice you don't have access to chat because today is a webinar session, but you are welcome to put all your questions in the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom or the top of your screen. So with that, I am very happy to introduce you all to Patricia Taylor. She'll be moderating today's session. Patricia Taylor is presently working on her doctorate in geoscience in the Earth, Energy, and Environment Department in the Faculty of Science. Over the past 14 years, Patty has worked at the University of Calgary as a research associate, English and academic research instructor, research assistant, and researcher. Her doctoral degree focuses on aquatic ecosystems within the riparian tracts along the Bow River shorelines, west of Cochrane and to the Rocky Mountains. Her known Indigenous heritage as a Métis person has lent itself to pursuing a deeper understanding of the two-eyed seeing and three-eyed seeing approaches to Indigenous and Western academic research. So welcome, Patricia. I will now pass it over to you.
Thanks, Alana Dawn. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you here. We're thankful that you could join us in this webinar. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Merle Ballard. She's PhD, Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Arts. She's an associate professor in the Department of Earth, Energy and Environment at the University of Calgary. She's advocated for the new Indigenous Science Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Anishinaabe from Lake St. Martin First Nation. Dr. Ballard's latest research explores three-eyed seeing and how her fluency in Anishinaabe-Moan can transform approaches to water resource management using Anishinaabe-Moan baseline indicators. Dr. Ballard also serves on a number of committees and working groups, two of which are recent appointments at scoping expert for the second IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and expert for the IPBES Task Force on Indigenous and Local Knowledge. She currently holds an NSERC, National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and a CIHR, Canadian Institute for Health Research grants. Additionally, additional research interests include, but are not limited to, climate change and sustainability of flooding displacement. Dr. Merle Ballard will be one of our speakers for today, and joining her will be Gavin Woodburn. Gavin is a Kwai First Nation. Hope I didn't mispronounce that. First Nation member from the west coast of British Columbia. Woodburn is currently completing his master's degree in geoscience at UCalgary, where he's focusing his research on regenerative forestry and rebuilding knowledge systems within his traditional territory in the remote islet of Kauai, rebuilding knowledge systems in Phillips Arm, BC. During his undergraduate studies at Carleton University in geophysics and Indigenous studies, along with his work with the Indigenous Science Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada, Woodburn has led a research project on clam gardens, an Indigenous technology that involved a deep understanding of the intertidal beach ecosystem to modify and provide thriving habitats with a food source for clams. Lastly, his research focuses on communicating and translating his knowledge systems and unique ways of knowing to the community, to the public, and Indigenous and Western trained scientists. So I would like to introduce our two speakers for today and pass it over to them.
Thank you, Patty. Can you hear us okay? And see our PowerPoint? Great.
Yes.
So thank you so much. So I'm Gavin. I'm Quaker First Nation.
Thank you.
No worries, it's all good. And I'd like to start off this talk with saying this word nanokiksala. This word in my language simply means to think about something. In addition to the land acknowledgement, which is to encourage you to learn and think about the original people who called this place home, I'd like to share some words about what that might mean in the context of this conversation. Indigenous science is inherently place-based because the knowledge came from and was developed by being on the land since time immemorial. This also means that the way in which we explain our knowledge might not be the same as other Indigenous peoples. However, many of the foundational concepts and ways of thinking, such as holism, can be seen globally. And we hope that our words today help you in your pursuit of understanding Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge systems. It's also important for us to think about the privilege we have to be able to talk about these knowledge systems today. While we are very fortunate to share these words with you, we have to acknowledge the broken knowledge systems our people no longer have due to displacement, residential schools, Western science, and many other reasons. With that being said, I thank you for having us here and ask that you listen and approach this topic with an open heart, an open mind, and good intentions. Gaila Kuzla.
We're gonna start this talk with an overview on Ethereal Seeing. We're gonna talk about Indigenous science, which is the Anishinaabe laws. Ethereal Seeing is about the Indigenous science, our relations on Western science. And we're gonna give the linkage, because it's all linked, it's not separate, biodiversity and what we can do towards climate action. Three Seeing is a framework that I developed, and it's a guiding framework. It builds on the Three Seeing framework, which is about the Western lens and Indigenous lens. But the Three Seeing framework is about the science of these lenses, because Indigenous science is a lens, Western science is a lens, and the lens of our relations is also a lens. So to understand the importance of these lenses, to braid and weave these lenses, is really critical to understand what each lens is saying and what each lens can do to contribute to the other lens. The framework is a tool for seeing, listening, learning, and understanding our environment, the ecosystem, with the different lenses, and using them together for solutions and for the benefit of all. Mostly the focus is with our relations, and the lens strengthens an understanding of protection and the conservation of the environment, the ecosystem. So this framework incorporates the Indigenous science lens, which includes the Anishinaabe laws of creation law, natural law, language law, traditional law, which I'm going to be talking about. And then the Western science disciplines as well. For example, and these are just a few: biology, physics, etc. And the lens of our relations, which is the land, the water, the air, the flora, the fauna. These are very important, because according to Indigenous peoples, we have to be the interpreters. We have to speak for the land. We have to speak for the water, etc. So you're asking what is our relations? It refers to everything besides humans, everything that cannot speak for themselves. For example, the birds in the air. We have to speak for the birds. Birds are really fascinating. They're more intelligent than man. That's what I think, because they build their own homes. They have that innate honing within them that takes them from their breeding habitats. When spring, summer comes, they know when to start flying north, south, wherever they live. So, and when they arrive at their place, they know what to start building, and they start building their little houses. Like they build their little houses from scratch. And this is so fascinating. And the other animals, like they have their territories. They know where to go look for food. So these are our relations, like the lands, the forest, the trees within the forest. They're alive too. They have voices, and we have to speak for them, and we have to recognize what they're saying. Water has a voice. We have to listen to the water. When I was growing up, my mother always told me, listen to the water, listen to what the water says. We have to respect the water, because the water can kill us too. So we always have to be on the the alert to what the water is saying.
Here.
What?
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Oh, okay.
the next slide.
We are the first responders. Indigenous peoples are the first responders of the land, because we are the stewards of the land, and we have to take care of our relations. So we have that responsibility for that relationship, the reciprocity to take care of our relations. And we need to be the ones that speak. We have to be the advocates. We have to be the voice. And we have that close connection to the land that enables us to bridge the voices of our relations. So Indigenous science is a science of its own. Indigenous science is very different from Indigenous knowledge. It's different from traditional knowledge because these knowledge systems, they have a connotation that they're very ancient, that they don't evolve, that they're static. But Indigenous science is very, it's real. Indigenous science is real-time science. It's a knowledge of what's happening today in real time because Indigenous peoples have close connection with the land that enables them to discern what's happening. They know the changes that are happening on the land when there's a change in water quality, like for when the water is a different color, when the water would taste different, they know these changes right away. When the fish migration patterns change, spawning sites differ, when there's changes in population, for example, the most population, when the birds disappear. Indigenous peoples know these right away because of the connection with the land. And Indigenous science is a science, the knowledge of medicines, plant medicine, and that's a science of its own. The ones that practice making the medicines, they know exactly what the plant has to look like. They know where to go. We were taught that we do not pick the plants that are close to the human. We pick the plants from deep in the forest where there's no contamination. So this is part of the knowledge system. Like they know what the color, once they start making the medicines, they know all this. This is the science behind plant medicine and the knowledge of the land. And then the teachings that we have too, they're based on respect, and they're based on responsibility. They're based on the relationships with our relations. These are all part of the relational values that we have with our relations. We have a code of ethics that is built within this relationship we have with the land. And Indigenous science involves the practical application of theories as well. Like we have our own theories within the knowledge that we have, the Indigenous science. We have stories that we have, but those stories they have embedded within the stories, like the responsibility that we have and not to take too much to preserve for the next 7 generations. These are all the stories that we have, and they're closely related to with the protection and management of the land, of the ecosystem. And an important thing too, Indigenous science is not a reductionist. Indigenous science is very Indigenous science is holistic. Like it involves everything, not just one component of the ecosystem. And within the Indigenous science, we have the natural law, the language law, the creation law, and the traditional law. Natural law refers to the natural order of creation, like the natural flow of currents, the natural flow of lands, the waters, the air, the cycles. And when we start to interrupt these laws, that's when we start seeing the problems that we experience. For example, climate change, when we start clear cutting, when we alter the way the waters flow, we start to alter the natural law. We have that responsibility. As I said, we have teachings that we get that were passed on to us from an early from childhood. For example, being Anishinaabe, we have words that are instilled in us the way we're supposed to treat what is around us, the natural law, that we don't interfere with it. These are the words that were spoken to me whenever I did strayed away from the natural law. Language law is really important too, because language describes the natural law within the Indigenous languages. We have words that are very specific to the rule of the ecosystem. And with these words, we can learn the proper way to monitor the environment, because these words are based on the original words that were given to an ecosystem. Like, for example, the word Saskatchewan in the province, it means Saskatchewan means where the water drains, evaporates. And when you start examining these words, you start to develop, you can start tracking what the indicators of change were from the original naming and before the settlers came, and to understand what the changes were within the environment, within the land. The creation law too is really important, because this is the origin of Ake, which means Ake means the world, the earth in my language, and it means everything from the core of the earth to the surface, to the atmosphere, to the galaxies. That's what that means. It's really important. It's really important to understand, because Indigenous peoples use the stars for navigation, and they still do. They understand the weather just by looking at the way the sun sets, etc., like the way the moon hangs. And these are all part of the knowledge that we have regarding the patterns, for example, weather patterns. And traditional laws are important too, because this is where the teachings are, the oral history, the ethics, the responsibilities that we have. And these are more human to human, where we have responsibility for each other as well, kapatawa, if we do something wrong to another person. So biodiversity is really important as well, and I'm going to get Gavin to expand on that.
Yeah, so when we think about biodiversity, especially in terms of Indigenous science, we think about the ways in which our people manage the lands to effectively enhance the landscape around them. One of these examples is actually a technology. And so what do I mean by a technology? Well, it's very simply, technology is the application of science. So essentially what we're doing is we're applying the Indigenous science to enhance the environment, to increase biodiversity, but essentially help increase our survival methods, our way of gathering food every day. This is how our people gathered food for thousands of years. And so one example of this is a lohiwe, or in other words, a clam garden. A lohiwe, in my language, Kwakwala, simply means place of rolling rocks. And so how a lohiwe is built is by moving large rocks down a steep beach slope to create a rock wall. And then over time, this rock wall fills in with loose sediment, sand, shell hash that's level with the lowest tide to target the prime growing habitat of clams. Now, this may seem pretty logical in that we're trying to create a better habitat for clams, but there's so much more that goes into the clam garden as to why it's so beneficial and so scientifically sound. Not only is this increasing clam size, population, and health, but this is also buffering the impacts from climate change, such as temperature and ocean. The way it does this, you might be able to see in this picture how there's darker areas on the clam garden, there's lighter areas. Well, the reason those areas are darker is because it's holding in more water. So when the tide goes down and the beach is exposed, those clams aren't being baked in the sun. That water that's being retained on the beach is actually helping keeping the clams cooler in the summers and warmer in the winters. And in the summers, when you have increased biotoxins that make clams unedible, this buffering of the temperature actually gives you more time to be able to eat clams, and thus it's a more stable food source for our people. And so Indigenous technologies work directly with the environment through understanding it. For example, a clam garden is placed in very specific areas. In this case, you can see how the rock wall goes out, connects to that island, and then from that island back to the beach, it connects again to make a larger surface. But it also has good water flow. So it's being able to wash away any contaminants that come by, but also being able to reduce the amount of silt and other sediment that can come and build up on it. There's other technologies that we have in our territory, such as fish weirs and forest gardens, and these help with the management of populations. So fish weirs are a way to be able to manage the fish that we're taking. We want to make sure we're not taking big ones that are good for the genetic pool, but we also want to make sure that we're not taking small ones or more females than males. So it's a way that we can actually manage those species. We also have forest gardens, but not just forest gardens. We grew different medicinal plants in each area of the ecosystem. So whether it's the estuary, just above the beach, in the forest, all these things can be altered and managed to better give us species that we need to survive. But these also inform climate change. So when you think about a clam garden and you think about the rock wall, we also know that sea level changes over time. It gets higher, it gets lower. And so by looking at the clam gardens, we see in other areas that the rock wall is actually well below the lowest tide. We also see other areas where the rock wall is much higher than the tide. So we're able to understand how climate change has shaped this landscape and how our people adapted. We see where a clam garden rock wall goes high up, and then the sea level rises, and then we see essentially a second rock wall that builds up on it. And so we can help to understand climate change through these relationships with Indigenous technologies, because ultimately how we adapted and survived was through the technologies that we created. And it's also important to understand that the perspective on these technologies are that all living beings are equal. And that us as humans are part of nature. We're not separate from nature, which is often how Western science divides itself. Western science often thinks of humans as separate from the environment, whereas we place it within itself. And so that means that when we're thinking about the animals and beings living in our lands and waters, it's our duty to respect them and treat them with the same autonomy that we would give ourselves as humans. So that means in a fish weir, there's a door, so fish, they can leave if they want to, but they're choosing to give themselves to us so that we can survive. And I'm just going to share this quick video. Hopefully it works, no problem. And this video is from my clam garden research that
clam gardens, or what we say in our language, lohiwe, which means place of rolling rocks, are where our ancestors, our people, actually took larger rocks from higher up on the beach, and they rolled them down to that lower intertidal zone, which essentially raised a rock wall, which would be filled in, that was level with that ideal habitat for clams. As part of understanding the clam gardens, why they were built, why they're working, we also wanted to make sure to add in some other research components through observation. We can go in further to see those relationships between the clam gardens and the people by looking through those shell middens, understanding the culture that was deposited for thousands of years.
Yeah, sorry, Gavin and Merle, we can hear the video, but we can't see it.
Oh no, I think I know what's wrong.
Okay.
Go here. Can you see that now?
Yes, yeah, thanks.
I'll just replay that. It's a short video anyways.
Clam gardens, or what we say in our language, lohiwe, which means place of rolling rocks, are where our ancestors, our people, actually took larger rocks from higher up on the beach and they rolled them down to that lower intertidal zone, which essentially raised a rock wall, which would be filled in that was level with that ideal habitat for clams. As part of understanding the clam gardens, why they were built, why they're working, we also wanted to make sure to add in some other research components through observation. We can go in further to see those relationships between the clam gardens and the people by looking through those shell middens, understanding the culture that was deposited for thousands of years. That's the beauty of science and research, is to be able to bring it back to the community and let everyone learn and connect again.
It's one of the largest operational radar dishes in the world. The Ballard,
There we go. Can you still see my screen?
We just see you both. We don't, if you have a visual up, we don't see it.
Okay. Sorry, just one sec.
Share screen.
Yes.
So it's important to understand the natural law of 3H seeing. When we talk about natural law, this is where the indicators we start to understand what the indicators are, because Indigenous peoples know the changes that are happening on the lands and waters and the air, etc. These are some of the quotes that I got from the Indigenous fishers and Indigenous knowledge holders of the waters regarding the change in species and the change in water. In the last 15 to 20 years, fish have relocated. They talked a lot about the relocation of fish, where there once abundant fishing waters, they're not there anymore. And the ancestors never ruined the lake, and they honored the lake. And the fishers used to just go and set their nets, but now they have to add extra floats to keep the nets off the bottom, because the fish do not feed on bottom anymore. The fish have their fish routes and migration patterns, but they are ruined due to fluctuating water levels. So these are some of the indicators of natural law, what has happened. There's also the alteration of the lakes, the rivers. And this is done in the name of development and for economic purposes. When we start building, when the outlet channels are constructed, it destroys the environment. It destroys the habitat of species that live in the area, with whether it's the species that live in the waters or on the land. They're affected, impacted, and it disrupts the natural law of the system, of the ecosystem. The waters, they drain, the waters get high, low, etc. They empty. This is an example. This is about a month ago, where Southern Chiefs organization in Manitoba is taking Lake Manitoba, wants Lake Manitoba to be given a personhood, because Lake Manitoba's voice needs to be heard, because right now Lake Manitoba is being destroyed. There's a lot of algae now, and the water levels are changing the water quality, and there's a lot of damage to the lake. So Lake Winnipeg needs to be given a voice, and the Southern Chiefs is leading the way. And a part of this is giving legal rights to waters, for example, and Indigenous peoples lead these efforts to protect them, because Indigenous peoples are dependent on the waterways. There were They were a source of highway, food source, natural pharmacy for centuries, still is. But with the threat of dams, the alteration of the water, it has a negative impact on the environment, and the social impacts are really felt by Indigenous peoples, because a lot of Indigenous peoples live right next to the waterways, so they feel the direct impacts of the negative effects of the development. The Magpie River in Quebec is another example of a river that was given legalhood. And again, this was led by the Indigenous peoples in Quebec. And the description below is a really vivid example of what the water is saying. A swoosh of raven wings echo in the crisp air. Beaver claws scratch against the rocks on the shoreline. The ice blockade upriver groans and creaks against the riding's water. It's springtime at the Magpie River. And this gives a sense of what the river is like, as a person. Like, imagine it being alive, and this is what it's doing. This is the voice of the river. As well, too, the Amazon River in South America, and the Wanganui River in New Zealand were also given legalhoods, a personhood, and again, they were led by Indigenous people. And these are some of the rights of the Magpie River. They're given the right to exist, to live, to evolve naturally. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but this is what we have to speak for regarding the waters. We have to give them that right to be free from pollution, to be free from alteration, etc. The United Nations recognizes that water can fight climate. Water is very important. Water is an indicator of the other, for example, climate change. When water is used sustainably, or if it's not used sustainably, it's an indicator of climate change. And we really have to manage water carefully, because we have the oceans, but we can't drink the water from the oceans. We don't have technology yet. Maybe the technology will be there, but right now we can't drink the water. So water is important for everything. It's important for life. And with Indigenous peoples, with alteration of water levels, when the land is flooded, Indigenous peoples will say the land weeps. They recognize that there's natural cycles. Flooding cycles are natural. The land floods every 50 years or so, and these cycles used to be respected. And the elders that I work with shared the stories of when the natural floods happened, that they used to leave the area and go to higher ground and allowed the land to regenerate. And the natural floods are a way of the land replenishing itself. But now land is flooded by the artificial flooding, and this kind of flooding, the artificial flooding, and destroys the land. It's not the same as the natural floods. With the people that I work with, this are some of the shots that I took with a drone. And the elders, the knowledge holders know that the roots are rotting because of the elevation of the groundwater. So because of the water system, the water system is a network of an intrinsic design by the natural law. So once you start to manipulate that system, you alter the natural law. So with this, this is an indication that there's two large lakes in between, a small lake and the area here. Lake Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg. These are the areas that I work with, and this is around Lake St. Martin. And these are the trees, because the reason around Lake St. Martin, it's becoming like a holding tank. There's nowhere else for the ground water to flow but to come up. So naturally, the trees, the roots are going to rot, and there's also a lot of water throughout the region that's rising up. And it's really important to work with the Western science as well, because working with the two knowledge systems, we can create better solutions. I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but working together with three lenses is really important. The Western lens, the Indigenous lens, and the lens of our relations, because we need those three voices. Indigenous science, we use modern technology as well to do the work that we have to do. Mapping the Indigenous names is really important, because they identify the original
Marilyn, Gavin, I think you've cut out. Let's just give them a moment to see. I know their internet might not be working. Just give them a couple minutes. I'm sure they're going to try and rejoin us.
If I may suggest, just for the moment while they're trying to log back in, maybe pose some of your questions into the Q&A. And then as soon as they're shortly done their presentation, we can start to take a look at those questions in the Q&A. So anything that's come to mind that you want to ask, maybe start posing those or putting those into the Q&A, and then we'll have the selection ready as soon as they return.
Thanks, Patty. That's a great idea.
We're back.
Yay, welcome. Sorry that happened.
Well, it's okay. It's unfortunate bad Wi-Fi here. But if we're good to keep going, I'll just
Yeah.
wrap things up and then maybe move to the Q&A.
Sure.
So I just wanted to quickly finish off by saying, what can we do, or how can we think about, or how can we see the land when it's weeping? How do we listen to it? And so I have one example that occurred in my traditional territory, where for the past 100 or so years, we've had a combination of clear-cut forestry, fish farms, and gold mining going on in our area, to the point where they dug out new rivers leading from the fresh watershed down to the ocean to move logs. Log booms increase just general presence in there, and as Indigenous peoples listening to my community members, we know that the fish populations have been hurting. But this past year, after about 4 years now of limited to no Western impact. So there's no more forestry, there's no more fish farm, and there's really no mining operations going on right now. We saw an absolute boom of pink salmon running through our streams once again. The numbers of upwards of 2 million, and Western science, their only understanding of that was these are not normal numbers. We need to go thin them out. But our question as Indigenous peoples are, well, how do you know these aren't normal levels? How do you know these aren't the levels that our people expected to see every year? But when we have continuous presence in remote territories, it's hard to know. So we have to understand that the baseline shift, data can't explain and understand everything that Indigenous people see. So it's important to use that third eye and just observe and listen to the land and see what it's telling us. And with that, I'd like to thank you all again for listening to our talk, and we would be super happy to hear some of your questions.
That was wonderful, Gavin and Dr. Ballard. I'm just going to, if it's possible, a couple questions that have come my way, that if I may introduce those first, pose those to you, and then I'll open it up to the audience and they can provide, we'll go to the Q&A and get some of the questions that they're asking as well too. So the first one is, how can someone implement Indigenous science into their work or research right away or over time? Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So the important thing when you incorporate Indigenous science is you have to have Indigenous peoples on board, because you can't do Indigenous science if you're not Indigenous science. You can't do Indigenous science if you're not Indigenous, but you have to use the people, the Indigenous peoples that know about species, that know about the land. You have to have them working with you.
And I also think it's important to think about your policies that you have in place. Think about your perspective that you're taking on the project. The easiest way to start thinking about Indigenous science is to actually just take a step back. You can reach out to your local community, start learning, and just think about placing yourself within the environment. What are your implications on the rest of the environment?
What can someone do to learn more about how to work with Indigenous communities?
The most important thing is establishing partnerships. You have to establish the connection. You have to build relationships. For example, if you're Indigenous, if you're a scientist that wants to do research with Indigenous peoples, you can't approach them a month before and ask them, can you be my partner? No, that's not the way it's done. You have to have those relationships built way ahead of time, at least a year, a couple of years in advance.
Okay, and I guess there's other ways as well too, by maybe taking OCAP training courses, webinars like this help as well too, to kind of introduce everyone to some of the ways to connecting with Indigenous people and some of the projects. It's about building relationships in the community and then letting them take the lead in the research. Okay. Another question, how much can changing our perspective on climate change using Indigenous science really help the climate now?
I think the easiest way to think about it is, when we think about Indigenous science and remember that it's place-based, that means by incorporating Indigenous science into climate change action, we're actually effectively doing many small things to help influence bigger change. So we can't say, oh, we need to do Indigenous science on a federal scale. It needs to start out within communities, step by step, until these small changes start to add up to the big picture and actually make global change.
Very good. So we could support local communities then, maybe by revitalizing Indigenous technologies and knowledge systems, and then include include that into the research or Western research. Be more adaptive to climate change, restore local ecosystems. Remember that it's place-based Indigenous science. And like you said, many small changes come to creating a big change. Okay, and one last question before we go to our Q&A, because I see we have a few questions coming up. Is there similar Indigenous science seen outside of North America? Is any other countries, or are any other countries doing more with it than Canada is?
There's indigenous peoples all over the world. And the indigenous science, the knowledge system is there. For example, the Sami in the Nordic countries, the Russian indigenous peoples as well, the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and other indigenous peoples that live in different countries as well. They have the knowledge, the science of looking after, protecting, and conserving the lands, the waters. They have that knowledge too.
Yeah, and maybe if I can provide an example from that is the Hawaiians. Not sure if anyone's ever heard of it, but they have what's called the Moku system, and in which they essentially divide up an island known as many sections called aupua'as, and it speaks to a system of land acknowledgement right from the tops of the mountains down to the ocean. And so it's a very methodical step-by-step way to how they manage the land and how they essentially shape their social structures.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's in Hawaii, right? And from what I understand too, South America has a lot of systems that they have in place that work, that connect directly to the land as well too. Yeah, so it is global. It is international. It's a lot of different countries. That's wonderful. I'm going to take it to the Q&A now and just take a look at some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A and pose those to you as well. Is Dr. Ballard's Three-Eyed Seeing Guiding Framework available to read as a full publication? I would love to learn more. Thank you.
It's not available yet, but it will be soon. So it'll be will be available soon for to be published.
Okay. Another one of the questions, I think mostly everyone here will probably be greatly appreciated once you do get that published as well, so that they have access. Do you have any frameworks or tools that you can suggest to help us listen to urban land, biodiversity, etc.?
That for me. Yeah, I think it's important because you have to realize that urban areas were once not urban. They were once forests or plains, whatever the case may be. So the only way they became urban was when they were cleared and settled. So going back to the history of the urban areas, to the populations of the first peoples, it's important that to learn about the history of their land. For example, Winnipeg is really, Winnipeg means dirty water. So where the two rivers meet, the history behind it before it became a city, the natural streams that were there that are now covered, and the way the water flows and the way the water is diverted, that this is all the history of Winnipeg. And Calgary too, it would have a history of that. So the Indigenous people living around Calgary would have a lot of information to share too.
Okay, Gavin, did you have anything you want to add to that as well, or?
I think the only thing I'd like to add to that really is just echoing the importance of language and understanding bioindicators and biodiversity in areas where we see it's heavily urbanized, many people there, we may not actually be able to see some of these environmental things because, well, it's covered in concrete. But what we can do by understanding and learning about Indigenous languages, we can learn about the names of places, and oftentimes the names of those places translate to the actual function of the area itself. And so that's why we can use language to understand bioindicators, climate change over time, and quite a lot.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that if I can too, because the language in itself is verb, whereas Western science tends to be based more on noun. It's within Indigenous language that we actually have the actions of care and stewardship towards the land engulfed within that single word. It tells you exactly how to respect what's happening with that land, the changes, everything. So because it's a verb, I just wanted to bring that up as well too. So it's an action word.
Mhm.
Another question. Since commercial fish farms are so destructive and introduce dangers such as lice to the wild fish, is there any way Indigenous knowledge can improve these industries if we can't get rid of them altogether?
Yeah, so I can't say that I have the answer to that, but I can say that I have some experience in seeing some of these alternatives. I'm yet to see positive effects from a fish farm. However, I can see fisheries that are not open water pens being actually a great contribution to salmon population. So when we see a fishery that's out of the water, not in their natural environment, it aids in just bringing up those juvenile salmon populations and then being able to release them. The thing that we need to understand about nature and wildlife is that it has this innate knowledge. You don't teach a bear how to dig a den. You don't teach a beaver how to build a dam. Just like you don't teach a salmon how to live in the ocean. And so we can help these population numbers by increasing the amount of juvenile salmon, but to have an Atlantic salmon growing in the Pacific Ocean, it just doesn't quite make sense. And so I think to me, that's where I see the most benefit, but unfortunately, my knowledge is limited into how we could improve open water fish farms.
Thank you. Another one, just coming to the university. How can the university and granting systems encourage more collaborative research between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities or individuals?
The university, the granting agencies encourage researchers to work with Indigenous communities if it involves Indigenous territories, for example. And as well too, there's laws that are out there, for example, Section 35 of the Constitution Act. Whenever you want to do something on Indigenous lands, you have to consult with the Indigenous peoples, and that's the same as research. And like I said, a relationship building is really important. You have to start building relationships, and anything to do with the land on water should involve Indigenous peoples, because just because you're not on Indigenous territories, you are on a Turtle Island, which is Indigenous land. So even when they dig holes in the ground, extracting rock, those are part of Indigenous land. So it should involve Indigenous peoples as well, because rocks are part of our relations. Rocks are used in the ceremonies, so they're very important too.
And I'd just like to echo that again. Right now, funding doesn't give a student room to actually develop a relationship. A lot of times funding, you need to have a research plan set, applied for, and then you can start. But when you're working with Indigenous communities, you have to begin with the relationship and then move to, okay, what do we want to do on this land? How do you want us? How do us, the scientists, want you, the community, to do this work and actually benefit your community? And so I think we need to have space within funding to essentially give students or scientists the startup and just a grace period to build that relationship. And Patty, I'm sure you also have a couple of thoughts on this subject, since that was nearly your profession for a little while.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that as well too, but I support what you're saying in terms of when the research is led out of the community, it takes time to build relationships and partnerships, and funding doesn't necessarily allot for that. For the collaborative process, it could take 6 months easily, minimum, to even build a relationship with a community. Typically, what is advised is a year in advance to be able to begin those relationships with communities and elders, but funding doesn't necessarily allot for that. It doesn't support ongoing collaborative efforts with the community. It doesn't provide it does, but it's minimum honorariums, gifting, tobacco for ceremonies, things like that. That's all at a minimum too. And so when you think of the knowledge that's being transferred from elders over to, or any of the community, natural understanding of the land that's being transferred over to the research, that needs to be respected and honored in many ways. And our granting system haven't quite grasped that we need greater honorarium, greater dollars in gifting to build those relationships. And I think the other thing is more clarification of what Indigenous research is. When we start to have tools and rubrics and kits and things like that help us to understand, how do we bring this together as Indigenous research? How do we streamline the plan, the methodology, and everything in our proposal so that it comes across as Indigenous research? And we need clarification again of what is Indigenous research. So I posed the question, as I did once before, was computer simulation. Is that Indigenous research? If you're not on the land, you're not working directly with members from a community, and you're only on a computer simulation program, but you are working with the lands to do the work that you are on the computer, is that Indigenous research? So I think granting systems as well, if they could facilitate some kind of assistance in knowing, what is Indigenous research. And then as researchers, when we come to it, we know exactly what needs to be included in the proposal prior to presenting it. So those are just a few ways. It takes time. And I don't know if granting systems are aware of that yet, that it takes time to build these relationships. It takes time to actually do the research. Many scholars are coming into Indigenous research and thinking, okay, I've got deadlines, I have to have this done. Coming in thinking, yes, we'll get this done in a certain block of time. No. It takes time. And to come into Indigenous research or Indigenous Western science combined in research, be prepared to take the time. And I don't know if granting systems have quite grasped that yet. So I don't know if that assists what you're saying, complements what you're saying as well. I'll just go to the next question. What is an appropriate way to approach Indigenous people that you would like to build a relationship with? I'm always concerned that I might be adding a burden or doing something that might be perceived as inappropriate.
It depends on the community too. There's a lot of questions regarding our relationships. I think we need to talk on this separate one. Because this is another area. This is a part of the reconciliation process at the TRC and the Truth and Reconciliation, which is a separate issue. So that's really complicated. It's not an easy answer, and I think this is the fourth question on that.
But maybe if I can give a couple examples, it's good to learn about the priorities of a community. And so you have to think about your location. For example, if you have a community that's in an urban area, they might have the capacity to be able to undertake science. They might be interested in how do they protect that land outside of the city so that it doesn't get urbanized. But then you have to think about, well, what about the communities that are far up north or in very remote areas? Well, they don't have money coming in to actually be able to even care about science of the environment. They have to care about, does their community have water? Does their community have food? Does their community have housing that is safe to live in? And so a big part of it is understanding the priorities of the community. But if you are in or near an urban area, a lot of times communities do invite the public out for powwows or other community events. It's good for you to go to these just to have a presence. You can start by talking to one person. That may lead to talking to another person. And so that's a very easy way to just make your presence known as a friend rather than someone who just wants to do research on their land. And the last tiny bit I'll say is a lot of communities do have contact us and consultate with us tabs on their websites. And so if you see a nation that has a consultation page, that means they are open to consultation. So you shouldn't be worried to contact that page and just approach it openly, not that you have this plan that you just want consent for, that you have an idea that you'd like to work together with.
And if I can just add to that too, I agree. If you can find out what the needs are in the community, what are the needs? Are they water? Are they something else? If you can find out those needs in the community, the likelihood is you'll have a better chance to connect. And the other is, like, I agree, to be involved in ceremony. So any events with the community, start to join the community, start to, become familiar with people that are in community and to talk with people in the community. But if you do have a discussion of research with someone in the community, it's always good to ask, what is the protocol? What is the protocol for this particular community so that I may honor and respect it? What is the honorarium typical for an elder? So that, and what is gifting? Is it cedar? Is it sage? Is it tobacco? It's good to ask those questions prior to coming in as well too. So yeah, so I'm just going to move on here to the next question. Would it not be more impactful to introduce Indigenous science as a subject in schools so that kids grow up understanding its importance? That way the knowledge is in the hands of many.
Yeah, I think we're coming to that point. There's a lot of schools that are starting to integrate Indigenous science, Indigenous land-based activities in their school, including non-Indigenous schools. So I think it's up to the school boards too within the various centers, but it is being integrated. Land-based training is important, is becoming a part of the curriculum, but I think with the higher grades, like in senior high school, I think that's where it should be really starting.
I also think logically, it just makes sense to begin incorporating Indigenous science within education. I mean, when at least when I was going through school in science, we were encouraged to question everything and challenge all other science and approach it from different perspectives and get other people's perspectives on a topic. And Indigenous science really is another way of just thinking and approaching science. It's not Western science. It's just placing yourself differently within the environment. And so even for non-Indigenous students, it's helping their knowledge, understanding, and way of approaching science to simply make a better scientist.
I agree. I think with you, as it gets introduced into the curriculum, Indigenous science, and I know at present now Alberta curriculum is already taking the science course and they've integrated Indigenous science into it. and have adjusted and adapted it so that it recognizes both sciences now. So I have colleagues that are working on that right now as well too. And I think it's important to learn and understand Indigenous science and what it's all about. But I think it's also a personal commitment as well too to build our own intercultural capacity. So with Indigenous engagement at the University of Calgary, there are so many different seminars, webinars that they do as well, too, videos, things like that, that help us, and ceremonies. They do blanket exercises, TP exercise. Just so many different opportunities for us to increase our own intercultural understanding so that when we do come to Indigenous science or a research project proposal, we're not coming with a lens. We've already opened ourselves up and we're already humble and we're already looking to learn just simply through our intercultural capacity building. And then as we move into research that becomes Indigenous and Western, we're more open to the different ways of how these two weave together, integrate together. But I think that's important, is building that intercultural capacity through a variety of different activities and ceremonies and readings. There's so many wonderful courses like OCAP that you can take that help you to understand, data sovereignty, things like that. Coming in informed like that into Indigenous research or Indigenous science, Western research really helps you to be open to the different ways that it can weave together. Because coming in with a lens, sometimes it's difficult to see possibility. So yes, I think it's a valid opportunity. Here's another question here. Would it be possible to request a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, and I'm sorry, but before I start, just looking at the time, we can probably answer one more quick question after this, and then we gotta get going back to a workshop. But are we releasing the PowerPoint?
Do we have? Yeah, we can share the PowerPoint. Do we have a lot more questions?
No, we're good for questions. That was the last of our questions.
Okay.
Oh,
okay,
well, perfect
great.
then.
Yeah. So
Others question?
That was PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah.
the PowerPoint.
Great. So I want to thank you all for attending our talk. I don't know the numbers, I can't see, but thank you very much. Jimmy Goich.
Gaila Kazla.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Really enjoyed learning from you today. And I love seeing all the hearts and claps, and thank you for all that you do. And I know you're very busy and have to run, so thanks for your time today. I guess I just leave it to you three if there's any final thoughts you want to share before people leave.
The work that I'm doing at the university, I think, is really important because it incorporates tracing and the use of Anishinaabe Indigenous language into biodiversity and in determining what the indicators are. I think people, the general public, should pay more attention to the Indigenous names. So that way they'll understand the original ecosystem that existed before the settlers came.
And I just want to thank you all again for listening and just say quickly that your actions just by attending this talk and listening with an open heart and an open mind is making a big difference. And this is one of those examples of small changes can make a big impact. So thank you again for listening and thinking about this knowledge that we're sharing.
I'd just like to say thank you for everyone attending as well too. And you can be a part of the webinar and to be introduced to three-eyed seeing and maybe consider incorporating that into your research as well too. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll let you go for your next workshop, and I'll see you everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.